Welcome to the examination of the most aggressive strategy for black in the Nimzo-Indian defense. You can apply this strategy in your own games and crush your opponents very fast if they don't know how to play against it. To illustrate this strategy, we'll analyze the most spectacular game where it was executed by a very creative player Vladimir Simagin against none other than the legendary Viktor Korchnoi. Korchnoi starts with c4, but after e6, knight c3, knight f6 and d4, the game transposes into the Nimzo-Indian defense. Korchnoi develops the king's knight, and here the common line for black is d5, challenging white's domination of the center. But in our game, instead of d5, with his next move, Simagin begins the execution of the most aggressive strategic plan in the Nimzo-Indian defense. He plays b6. The idea is to fianchetto the bishop, putting pressure on white's king side and taking the crucial central e4 square under control, after which black is going to castle, followed by centralization of the knight, and the white knight isn't really defending this square as it's pinned, and after knight e4 black will play f5, reinforcing his central knight even more, after which black is going to start a very strong attack on the king side, as his f8 rook after black castles will be rerouted via f6 to either g6 or h6. Now if white plays a3 right away, black would simply exchange and white's pawn structure on the queen side would be damaged. That's why first Korchnoi develops his queen defending the knight, and only after bishop b7 he plays a3. Now, of course, it wouldn't make any sense for black to retreat the bishop in order to retain the bishop pair, as the knight would be unpinned, and together with the queen it would control the e4 square and white would occupy the center and have a big advantage. So, of course, instead of retreating the bishop, Simagin exchanges on c3, after which white gets the advantage of two bishops, but black in his turn has the total control over the crucial e4 square and the development advantage. So Simagin castles, and as you see, black king is already safe while the white king is still in the center. Besides that, while black has developed two minor pieces, white developed only one. That means white must think about the development of his king side, and in order to do it he must play e3, either right away, which Korchnoi did in our actual game, or as e3 would close the bishop's diagonal, first white can develop the bishop, pinning the black knight, and only then play e3. So bishop g5 is actually perfectly playable, but white must consider h6, of course, in this case. After possible bishop takes f6, white loses his only advantage, the advantage of two bishops. So black has a slight advantage in this position. So after possible bishop g5 and h6, it would be better for white to retreat. But again, white must consider the possibility of g5, either right away or later in the game. After g5, on the one hand, of course, black weakens his king side. On the other hand, he unpins his knight, and he can centralize his knight again with a tempo, also targeting the bishop, so black can exchange at any moment, depriving white of his advantage of two bishops, or black can retain his knight on e4 and increase the pressure on the king side with f5. So it seems that Korchnoi wanted to avoid all these variations with bishop g5, so he opts for a quieter option, which is also perfectly playable. He plays e3 right away. Of course, the bishop's diagonal is closed, but in the anticipation of black's attack on the king side, Korchnoi is planning to initiate a counterplay on the queen side with b4, after which he will solve the problem of the bishop by playing bishop b2. Simagin plays d6, vacating the d7 square for the second knight, b4 followed, knight d7, bishop b2, and Simagin centralizes his knight with a tempo. The queen retreats and black reinforces his knight. Now black has a great knight, which is supported by the pawn, by the bishop, and his rook can be brought into the attack of the white king side. So now white must develop his bishop. he has two squares to do it, and each of these options has their advantages and drawbacks. Bishop d3, on the one hand, increases the pressure increases the control over the crucial e4 square. On the other hand, from d3, the bishop doesn't defend the knight, which might fall under attack of the black bishop. So Korchnoi opts for bishop e2 instead, which doesn't defend the crucial square but defends the knight instead. After bishop e2, white is ready to castle, but Simagin prevents it with a very strong move, knight g5, attacking the knight 2 times. And it turns out that it isn't that easy to play this position for white. Indeed, what should white do? He cannot castle, as black would exchange on f3 twice and destroy white's pawn structure, exposing the white king. h2 is terribly weakened, and by playing queen h4, black starts a decisive attack, followed by rook f6, rook h6, and it isn't clear how white is going to hold h2. So, short castle doesn't work. What else can white do? If he exchanges the knights, then after queen takes g5, it isn't clear how white is going to hold the g2 pawn. The only natural way of defending it is bishop f3, but in this case, again, black would have destroyed white's pawn structure, deprive white of his only advantage, the advantage of 2 bishops, and black would be better. What else can white do? Maybe in the anticipation of black's attack on the king side, he can try hiding his king on the queen side. But it turns out that the king isn't safe on the queen side either. Black would play knight e4 with a tempo, attacking f2, and after bishop d3, white defends f2, but black can start a very strong attack on the white king on the queen side too, by playing either a5 or c5, opening files on the queen side and starting a very strong attack. So, what should white do? All these moves, short castle, long castle, or knight takes g5, don't work. The strongest move is suggested by the engine, which isn't so easy for a human to find. The move is d5, a pawn sacrifice, in order to open the bishop's diagonal and vacate the d4 square for the knight. After possible e takes d, c takes d, black has an option, either to accept the sacrifice with bishop takes d5, but in this case white can play knight d4, attacking f5, so black can try f4, saving his pawn and putting pressure on e3, but in this case the knight still invades f5. In his turn, white is attacking g7 and white is slightly better. But in this variation, after d5, e takes d, c takes d, black isn't forced to accept the sacrifice, capturing on d5. Instead, he has a stronger move. The white pawn, when it was on d4, controlled the e5 square. And now that the white pawn has moved to d5, e5 square is weakened. One of the defenders of this square is the white knight, so black can eliminate the defender, and after bishop takes f3, the black knight can invade this square, again threatening to capture, damaging white's pawn structure, followed by bishop takes d5, and the best thing white can do is to give up one of his bishops. Bishop takes e5, d takes e, and the position would remain more or less equal. But again, for a human, it was very difficult to find this d5 move, so Korchnoi makes a more human move. He continues his counterplay on the queen side. He plays c5, threatening c6 with a fork, also closing the light-squared bishop's diagonal. For this reason, to prevent this, Simagin plays bishop e4 with a tempo, attacking the queen. Now his bishop will remain on this crucial long diagonal. And here Korchnoi makes an inaccuracy. He should have retreated his queen to the initial square. Of course, it looks passive, but it has an idea. The queen, together with the bishop, would have reinforced the knight. And now, after possible exchanges on f3, eventually, instead of capturing with the pawn, white can capture with the queen, keeping his pawn structure on the king side intact. And that would let white castle kingside. But it looked too passive to Korchnoi, so instead of queen d1, he plays queen c3, which looks much more active. White creates the bishop and queen battery, and probably white is even thinking about d5, opening the diagonal and threatening checkmate. So, of course, now Simagin still could have exchanged twice on f3 and damage white's pawn structure on the king side, which probably was objectively stronger than what he did in the actual game. But Simagin was an artist, so he didn't want just to get a slight positional advantage and then try to exploit it. He was playing for an attack on the white king, and he will need both of these minor pieces in his attack. So, instead of capturing on f3, he plays bishop d5. Blockading the d-pawn, now it cannot move forward, so the dark squared bishop will remain bad, and vacating the e4 square for his knight. And the knight will jump on e4 with a tempo, attacking the queen. So what should white do? If he tries to prevent knight e4 by exchanging the knights, again after queen takes g5, the g2 pawn would fall under attack. If white tries to continue his counterplay on the queen side instead, by opening the c-file, by capturing on d6, and after c takes d, it might seem that with rook c1 white can completely dominate the open file, the only open file, but it isn't the case. Black would have exchanged, and after the exchanges, again, white loses the advantage of two bishops, his pawn structure is damaged, and it turns out that it's black who will dominate the only open file after rook c8. So instead of this, instead of c takes d, as it doesn't give him any advantage, Korchnoi pushes the pawn forward, grabbing more space on the queen side. Of course, the c-file will remain closed, but Korchnoi was planning to open the a-file instead by pushing the a-pawn forward. But as the game will show, he will not have time to do this. The black knight is under attack, but before moving it, first Simagin centralizes his knight with a tempo. After the white queen retreats, now he brings the second knight to the king side, so black pieces come closer and closer to the king side, because the white king cannot remain in the center, neither can he castle queen side, because the queen side is terribly weakened, so the only option the white king has is castling king side. But on the king side, the white king will turn into a target of attack. So white finally gets a chance to castle, as his pawn structure is intact now. Black cannot demolish it anymore by the exchanges on f3, so Korchnoi castles. But now Simagin transfers his queen to the king side with a tempo, queen e8, attacking c6, b5, defending the pawn, and queen h5. And now it becomes obvious that the white king is in trouble, because there are so many black pieces taking part in the attack, and the rook will join the attack soon. The white knight cannot move, as the bishop would be lost. That's why Korchnoi defends the bishop. Now he might think about moving the knight away with the discovered attack on the black queen. That's why queen h6, moving away the queen from this diagonal, and also, which is very important, targeting the e3 pawn. You will see later why it's so important. Korchnoi continues his counterplay on the queen side with a4 and knight g4, coming closer to the white king and creating a terrible threat. The queen, together with the knight, are targeting the h2 pawn. The only defender is the knight, and black is threatening to play knight g5, removing the defender of h2 by the exchange with a tempo, with a check, followed by queen takes h2, checkmate of course. To prevent this, Korchnoi plays h3. And we have reached the first critical position. What to do? The knight is under attack. You can pause the video and try to find Simagin's brilliant solution. Instead of retreating the knight, Simagin sacrifices it. He brings his rook into the attack, rook f6, with a terrible threat of rook g6, which would pin the g-pawn, after which black will be ready to move away the knight from the g-file with a tempo by capturing on e3, and after f takes e, as the g-pawn would be pinned, the queen can capture on h3, and black would threaten checkmate on g2. So to prevent all this, Korchnoi accepts the sacrifice. He captures the knight. But now, after f takes g, the pawn becomes very strong, putting pressure on white's position. So the pawn takes part in the attack, restricting white's kingside, kicking out the knight from f3. Besides that, the pawn might move forward at any moment. Besides that, after the pawn disappeared from f5, the f-file is open for the black rooks. Korchnoi retreats his knight to h2, attacking g4, threatening to capture it with a fork. So it's a threat. And we have reached the second critical position. Now you can pause the video and try to find how Simagin dealt with this threat. Of course, g3 doesn't work, because it doesn't prevent the threat. White still would play knight g4 with a fork, winning the exchange, as the knight also defends h2, so there is no checkmate, so white is winning in this case. Of course, Simagin didn't do it. Instead of g3, now you can see why it was important to target the e3 pawn. Simagin eliminates the f2 pawn, which was defending the e3 pawn, sacrificing the second knight, and preventing knight takes g4, which would be a blunder because of checkmate in 1. The knight is defended by the rook, and the queen is defended by the knight. So, after knight takes f2, after the sacrifice of the second knight, Korchnoi has no choice. He must accept the sacrifice of the second knight. Rook takes f2. And only now g3 with a fork. Again, white has no choice. He cannot capture the rook because of checkmate in 2 moves. So, actually, by playing g3, Simagin forces his opponent to execute his threat. So, Korchnoi plays knight g4 with a fork. But it turns out that it doesn't work. The knight will not have time to capture any of these pieces because of g takes f, of course, with a check. And white must capture the pawn with the knight, as king f1 doesn't work because of the same checkmate in 1. So the knight must retreat, capturing the pawn. White still has the material advantage. He has 2 minor pieces for a rook, but black's attack continues. Besides that, now the e3 pawn falls. Queen takes e3. Pinning the knight and attacking it for the second time. So white pieces, the bishop and the rook, although white has material advantage, these pieces don't take part in the defense of the king. White must defend the knight, and now the last piece comes into play with great effect, renewing the threat. Korchnoi closes the f-file, also attacking the black queen, but another spectacular move follows. The bishop is one of the key defenders of white's king, so Simagin sacrifices the exchange this time. Rook takes f3, also defending the queen. If white captures the queen, then after rook takes e3, now black would have material advantage besides his positional advantage. So, of course, instead of queen takes e3, Korchnoi accepts the sacrifice one more time. He captures the rook. But now queen takes f3, threatening checkmate. queen f1 doesn't work because of checkmate in 2 moves. So Korchnoi plays king f1 instead. If queen g2 check now, the king would escape via e2, but Simagin prevents it. Bishop c4 check, forcing the white king to return to g1. Queen g3 check, king h1. The white king is in the corner. Now, of course, black could have played simply rook takes f2, threatening checkmate, which would lead to checkmate in a few moves, for example, like this. But instead of this prosaic continuation, Simagin finds a much more artistic checkmate. Instead of rook takes f2, he gives a check from d5, and after knight e4, the knight is defended by the white queen. In order to deflect the white queen, Simagin sacrifices the second rook, rook f1 check. And after queen takes f1, the knight would fall, followed by checkmate. For this reason, after the brilliant move rook f1 check, Korchnoi resigns. And now I recommend watching another attacking masterpiece by Simagin, this time in the Nimzo-Indian Defense. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.